Good morning, everybody. My name is Sarah. It is Wednesday, hump day. Going to be on the downward side of the week here after today's work day. A little congested today. I don't feel sick. I don't even feel like I have a cold. I'm thinking I had the windows open overnight, and we've had some very high levels of allergens here. So I'm thinking I might just be a little irritated with some pollen and all that nice deliciousness flying around outside. But I'm going to get outside for a ride. It's in the 50s. Sun's supposed to peak out the next hour or two and hopefully get lymphatic system moving, start flushing out some of that stuff. Some very ladylike and polite snot rockets may find their way onto the road, but that's the plight of the cyclist. But I'm going to get going, get on my ride. Nothing like a driver to get you worked up in the first 5 minutes of your ride. You know, I'm cruising along on the road back there, and a car pulls out of a side street on my right, pulls out and turns right out in front of me. Well, if they were going to get up to speed, it wasn't going to be that big of a deal. But then she immediately stops, bridging the shoulder where I'm riding in, and I got to hit my brakes, and I'm almost into the fucking ass of her car, on her, you know, in her trunk or whatever. And I'm like, what are you doing? She's like, I'm looking for a house, calm down. I'm like, you realize you just pulled out in front of me and I could have hit you at 22 miles an hour. Are you stupid? Like, I was probably more mad than I should have been, but it was like adrenaline. I was afraid. I thought I was gonna, like, I'm not gonna kill per se, but probably hurt. And it just blows my mind how completely clueless some drivers can be. I mean, as a cyclist, you have to be 100% attentive all the time. And that was probably a 5-second difference between me probably breaking something and me just barely missing the rear end of her car. I'm looking for a house. That's fine. So you couldn't wait for me to pass you so that you can drive at 4 miles an hour on the shoulder. I'm looking for a house, she says. Just gotta laugh. So as a lot of us in the northern hemisphere are approaching our in-season, I know personally my videos have been talking about training quite a bit, some strategies when it comes to training, and make references to TrainingPeaks. And I don't know how many of my viewers are intimately acquainted with some of the jargon or verbiage that's aligned itself with cycling and TrainingPeaks and some of these softwares. So I thought this would be a good video to kind of talk about these like different acronyms and quote unquote fancy terms when it comes to cycling training. So hopefully it explains it in a way that's a little bit more understandable than just the kind of text on white background that they have in TrainingPeaks. Because I think if you're not intimately acquainted with these terms or these ideas, it might be a little abstract. So hopefully I can demystify some of that for some of my viewers that are newer to the sport or newer to these kind of training metrics. So first and foremost is power. Power is a metric of the amount of force that you're applying to your pedals or to your cranks. I think most people who are into cycling and have done any kind of research on training have probably been exposed to the idea of power. So I'm not going to go into too much detail. But what I will touch on is that power is a measure of output. It's a measure of the strength or the fitness you have on the bike in a lot of cases. And that leads to your FTP or functional threshold power. Now I did a video the other day talking about functional threshold power and lactate threshold and the difference. So I'm going to link that down below. But just to kind of briefly recap, functional threshold power is accepted as the amount of power a rider can output on the bike for an hour without breaking past their lactate threshold or without really breaking down. It's uncomfortable, it's challenging, and we usually test this capacity via some kind of shorter training segment, whether it's an 8-minute, 20-minute, 30-minute test. Again, I invite you to take a look at that video that I posted the other day. It's a lot more in depth when it comes to power and lactate threshold. Lactate threshold is very intimately acquainted with functional threshold power, and it is just the physiological response to that type of power. They're not always the same. Functional threshold power is output, and lactate threshold is kind of It's measured in the number of millimoles of lactate building up in your blood, and that ratio to how fast you can clear that lactate. It's really ultra specific. If you're very into training, it's something worth getting tested, but usually an FTP test can get you pretty close to the amount of output you can achieve while remaining in that zone. Now, assuming that you have a decent understanding of what power and functional threshold power kind of mean, that's what gets you into the more acronyms that might be a little bit more complicated, a little bit more abstract. So I'm going to try to explain them in a way that's pretty easy to understand. Now, there's a couple of ways of getting a power-based equivalent of how much power you expend on average during a ride. There's brute average power, and that's literally just creating an average of your highs and lows and your mids and giving you the average amount of power you expended for a ride. For a road racer, for somebody who does a lot of surges, a lot of changes, a lot of oscillation in power, average power is almost always a useless number. For long course endurance athletes, triathletes, average power becomes a lot more important, and I'll explain that in a couple minutes. The other number that most road cyclists look at is normalized power. And what normalized power is it's an average of your power numbers, but what it does is it kind of dumps the spikes off of both ends. So it dumps the zeros from coasting out, and it dumps the really high, occasional 1,000-watt surges out, and gives you kind of a more meaty average of how much work you are doing for the bulk of a race or an event, a training ride, something like that. Now, there are a few instances where your difference or your relationship between your average power and your normalized power might be important. Like I said, with long course, maybe endurance distance like triathlon, or time trials. So there's a concept in training known as the Variability Index. It is the relationship between your average power and your normalized power in terms of a decimal, which can be converted to a percent. So I'll give you an example. If your average power is 100 watts and your normalized power is 100 watts, your variability index is 1. You divide those from each other, you get 1. That is a very smooth ride. That's something that you'd love to see in a time trial or a long course triathlon effort. On the other hand, for something like a crit or a road race, you might see a number like 1.5. Like your normalized power is 150 watts, but your average power is 100 watts. It's not a very smooth ride. It's full of surges and recoveries. So that number is a lot more important for people who are training for triathlon or long course events, and not quite as important for people who are into road racing. So what's the point of computing your normalized power? Well, it's to give you an idea of what your intensity was for the ride. You may have seen the acronym IF, or intensity factor, and it's a decimal equivalent, or it can be converted to a percentage, of how hard you can ride against your FTP. So your FTP is considered 100%. Now, it's really not 100% of your maximum power. It's just 100% of your threshold, like we talked about, that you can hold for an hour. So if your threshold is 200 watts, and you do a ride at 200 watts for, let's say, an hour, your intensity factor will be 1. Or if you multiply that by 100 to create your percentage, it's 100% intensity. Or given your functional threshold power is 200 watts again, and you do a ride with a normalized power of 100 watts, your intensity factor will be 0.5 or 50%. Usually on Strava you'll see it as a percentage, but on TrainingPeaks and a lot of times in the Garmin you'll see it as that decimal. So just bear in mind that they're pretty much the same thing. Now, this becomes important because when you want to calculate your zones for what you're riding in, for what your training plan is dictating, or what type of ride you want to do, you want to hit a certain objective. A 50% or 0.5 intensity factor is probably a really cruisy recovery ride in zone 1, maybe zone 2 at the highest. A 0.75 or 75% is a moderate, probably mostly tempo ride. And 90% plus is probably a race effort. But I'm going to go over zones later in the video. Basically, what you need to keep in mind is that your IF, or intensity factor, is how intense you're riding in a single ride. And very often with computers these days, you can actually track that live to see if you're meeting your objective. So my Garmin tells me right now what my intensity factor for this ride is right now, and that may change over the course of my ride as I'm finishing my warm-up. So I think most people get a pretty good handle on intensity factor and power and all that stuff. But where things get a little fuzzy for a lot of people, and myself included when I first started with like TrainingPeaks, is the idea of like TSS, TSB, CTL, ATL, all that stuff. So I'm going to try to go through that stuff as concisely but clearly as possible. So TSS, much like intensity factor, is a rating for a single ride. And as opposed to being like the intensity against your power, it's the amount of stress that your intensity has put on your body in numerical form. So there's a very complex formula used by these softwares to compute TSS, but to give you a ballpark, something easy to understand, if you do 100% or you work at your threshold for 1 hour, you will get a TSS score of about 100. Now if you do that for 2 hours, forgetting the fact that most people can, really nobody can do 100% for 2 hours, or else it wouldn't be their threshold or their 1 hour power, your TSS would be 200. In the same account, if you do 50% of your threshold for an hour, your TSS will be about 50. So if your threshold is 200 watts and you ride 100 watts for 1 hour, your TSS score will be 50. If you run 100 watts for 2 hours, your TSS will be about 100. Basically that 1 hour times 2, or that 50 times 2 would equal 100. Again, it's not perfect science, don't try to dig that apart. It just gives you a general idea of how to look at TSS. Now that TSS, or training stress score number, as a standalone is not really an effective number. People don't just use TSS on its own. TSS is a construct of CTL, or chronic training load, which is also referred to as fitness. So chronic training load, or your fitness, or CTL, is a little more complicated, but if you just kind of slow down and look at the math, it's really pretty straightforward. So your CTL is the last 42 days average of your TSS, or training stress score. So for the sake of easy math, if for a month and a half or 42 days straight, you did a TSS of 50 every single day, your CTL, or chronic training load, would be 50. But you wouldn't be increasing fitness, you would just be at a flat line, because that 42-day rolling average would remain at the average of your training stress score. Now conversely to that, let's say you're coming out of your base season, or you're building for your race season. Let's say your TSS goes from 30 TSS in week 1, and then you're going up to 45 TSS in week 2, and then 55 in week 3, and so on and so forth till you hit the 42 days. You're going to see that average start to increase, which means you're increasing your fitness. Well, the Weather Channel lied to me and it was windy as hell my whole ride, but that's okay. But back to the conversation about your CTL, or your fitness. There's a certain point at which you're going to peak. Both just kind of peak in terms of like your training and your periodization, but peak in general. If you consider that your training stress scores, you're only going to be able to go so high, right? Unless you're talking about like extreme, adventure riding 200 miles a day or something like that. You're only going to be able to go so high in terms of how much intensity you can put in your ride, how long you actually have committed to your training to ride. And then if you consider that your CTL is an average of that, in order to maintain that average, let's just say for the sake of numbers, you are at a CTL, or fitness, of 100. In order to maintain that 100, you have to continue to average 100 TSS on a daily basis, whether it's maybe 200 today, and then 50 this day, and then 150. The math is going to work out in a certain regard. But if you continue to move up and up and up, there's going to become a certain point where you're going to have to plateau, where it's just there's not enough training or time in the world to really push past that point. And most people consider that their kind of racing peaks. For a lot of people in the amateur circuits, it's somewhere between like 110 and maybe 150 CTL. And as their fitness and their training volume increases, they're able to maintain that a little bit more easy. But that's when you kind of see the difference between your ramp rate to increase your fitness kind of go from steep to tapering or plateauing off. So it's kind of, it can get a little bit muddled, but if you kind of stop and think about it in just terms of averages and just kind of the intensity you're putting in, as you add, you're capped at a certain amount of intensity, you're capped at a certain amount of time on the bike, so your average as such is going to be kind of capped. Now, that CTL or fitness does not stand on its own. It has two other counterparts, and that's your ATL, which is your acute training load, and then your TSB, your training stress balance, or your form. So let's start with ATL. Your acute training load is the same kind of concept as your CTL, but instead of 42-day rolling average, it's 7-day rolling average. So that number, very often, if you're in the high training block or a heavy training week, will be higher. And if you're on a recovery or training, or a taper week, that's going to be lower. So that's going to tell you more of a snapshot of how maybe tired you're going to be. So you could have a chronic training load of 100, but your acute training load could be 150 because you had a big training week, you had put a lot of big rides in, a lot of intensity in. So they're kind of two different things. One's looking at fitness, one's looking at how tired you are. Now those two numbers really are working together to compute your form. So your TSB, or your training stress balance, is the difference between your fitness and your acute training load. So the calculation is very simple. Whatever your CTL is, you subtract your ATL and you get your form number. And when your form is negative, that means you're fatigued. When your form is positive, that means you're rested or you're in good form. But there's also a gradient for those types of things. So most people can race pretty well anywhere between -10 and +10. 0 is like a really great number. You're perfectly well balanced between your kind of taper and your training stress. So nailing somewhere around 0 is great. But most people do pretty well between that -10 and +10. Now, if your acute training load is 130 and your chronic training load is 120, you're going to take 120, subtract 130, and you're going to get -10. You're feeling pretty good. You're a little bit backwards. You're kind of building your fitness by overreaching what you have done in the past 42 days, but you're doing all right. As you go past -10 and the -15 and -20, you're starting to feel a little bit tired. You're getting to the point where, yeah, probably got to throw a rest day in or a taper day in, something like that, or a taper for a couple of days. As you exceed -20 into your negatives, you're starting to get to the point where you're kind of upside down and you need to kind of throw in some recovery days because you're just not going to be able to elicit the results that you want. You do not want to race at -20, -25, -30 or beyond. Not to say that you can't, but you're definitely, for your physiology, for your training, for your power profile, you are not going to be at your peak. On the reverse side of the spectrum, if you take a recovery week and you end up averaging 50 TSS per day for the week, so your ATL is 50 and your CTL is 100. If you subtract those two, this is a really extreme example, but if you subtract 50 from 100, your form, or your TSB, is going to be +50. Okay, so you're going to seem like, holy shit, I'm in great form. But there's a certain point where if you taper off too much, yeah, you're going to be rested and your legs are going to be fresh and ready to go. But by that same merit, you're going to be flat. You're going to lose too much fitness. You're too off the end. And again, you're not going to see really a +50 unless you're like taking a lot of time off the bike. But I'm just trying to give you an idea of math. But let's say you're at 100 CTL and then this week you were at maybe 90. You kept your average around 90, so your ATL is 90. You're going to be at a +10. So that +10 is just like, okay, I've tapered, I'm losing a little bit of fitness, my fitness is starting to come down, so that difference is probably going to shrink a little bit. but at the same rate, I'm ending up a little bit more fresh. So when I'm basically ready to rip the pedals right off my bike. It's important that you understand kind of how these numbers relate to each other and what they mean so that you can read them. But in terms of the math behind it, there's software to do that. So you don't have to be, a mathematician, be able to kind of figure this stuff out in your head, because it's very proprietary math. But if you kind of understand how these things relate to one another, you'll be a lot more effective in being able to use TrainingPeaks and then their performance management charts, which is just kind of a graph of those three things. You can actually add different data points and things like WKO and different softwares, but I'm not going to get into that. But generally speaking, most people look at their performance management chart, which is just kind of a graph of the difference between their training stress balance, their acute training load, and their chronic training load. And it's very obvious when you look at that over the course of a year, over the course of a couple years, where you're in season and you're off season. And then if you're looking in smaller blocks, you can kind of see your build, peak, taper, recover, and you can kind of see there's a pattern to it. So hopefully, defining those terms made things a little bit more effective in terms of seeing how TrainingPeaks works. If you're going to try a free trial of it, or if you're a user of TrainingPeaks but you're not exactly sure what you're looking at, hopefully that'll help you look at it with a little bit more understanding of where those numbers work and what they mean to you in your training. So one of the last terms I want to talk about is decoupling. Decoupling is something that you might see, and it actually references the relationship between your heart rate and your power and the zones that those fall within relative to one another. So I want to talk about zones after this, but the general idea is that your heart rate zone and your power zone, all other things remaining equal, should be the same. So if you're riding your bike at zone 3, your heart rate is expected should be in zone 3. If you drop your power down to zone 2, but your heart rate stays at zone 3, your heart rate doesn't recover down to zone 2, you're starting to decouple, which means that there's probably kind of a fitness inefficiency, like an aerobic inefficiency, that you can work on in the terms of your training. Or conversely, if your power stays the same, but your heart rate starts to go up, again, you're decoupling, your heart rate's starting to break down. There's probably an inefficiency in that zone, and it's something that can just be worked on in training. Now, that's not always an accurate representation of your fitness. There's something to be said about artificial inflation to your heart rate. There's, excitement or nerves in a race. There's being over caffeinated. There's temperature. There's a lot of things that can affect your heart rate. So it's not a rule of thumb that can be used in every single incident. But if you notice it over time, over several rides, that, you might be sitting at your zone 2, but after, an hour, you can see your heart rate starting to creep up. It starts to break down. It means that your aerobic endurance, your zone 2 endurance for those longer distances needs to be more challenged, more tuned in, just better trained. Okay, so now about zones. There are generally, for most training plans, 7 different zones of training. Most of your plans and coaches are going to subscribe to the Andrew Coggin method of training zones. Joe Friel's training zones they're actually the same, except his labels. So Andrew Coggin's training zones go through zone 1 through 7. And Joe Friel goes 1 through 5, A, B, and C. So instead of having 5, 6, 7, he's got 5A, 5B, 5C. I like the nomenclature for Andrew Coggin's training zones, so I'm going to follow that. But just so you know, if you see 5A, 5B, 5C, against what I'm referring to here, 5A is zone 5, 5B is zone 6, and 5C is zone 7. So for all these zones, I'm going to give you a percentage range for your power output. And that percentage is out of 100 being your functional threshold power. So 100 is not your max power. So for the upper zones, I'm going to be exceeding 100%. This is based on your established functional threshold power. I'm also going to be giving you a rate of perceived exertion in case you don't have a power meter and you want to try to estimate what zones you're in based on kind of your heart rate and how you're feeling. I'll give you kind of an idea of how those particular those power zones are going to feel as you execute them on the bike. So starting with zone 1, zone 1 is your active recovery zone, and it comprises anywhere between 1 and 55% of your functional threshold power. It is actually the largest zone based on percentage points, so it constitutes over 50% of your functional threshold power. This is the zone where you are actually recovering while you are turning your legs over. So you're not really putting any additional stress on your body. You're literally, this should feel very easy to you. Your rate of perceived exertion should be about a 1. So if you were talking about, maybe like a scale of 1 to 10, we're talking about 1. Next is zone 2. Zone 2 is actually a zone that people actually do recovery in because it is a lower intensity zone. But it's not considered your recovery zone. Even though you may have recovery rides prescribed in zone 2, it is actually considered your endurance zone. And your zone 2 covers anywhere from 56 to 75% of your functional threshold power. So there's about a 20% swing there that will comprise your endurance zone. This is where you kind of build your aerobic engine. This is where you'd want to spend the time if you're doing very long rides, like your 5-6 hour rides. I guess if you're an upper category racer, you've got more capacity to do higher intensity and longer rides. But basically, when you have a plan and they put your Sunday long ride in there, your prescription for your ride is going to be mostly zone 2. And this will be this area, this endurance zone. And this is really getting your legs used to the miles, and then your heart rate used to kind of being in that aerobic zone and being efficient in that aerobic zone. Your rate of perceived exertion is probably going to be 2 to 3. Zone 3 is tempo. Zone 3 is going to comprise of anything between 76% and 90% of your FTP. So things are starting to get swift and quick, and you're starting to put some intensity into the pedals. It's your go all day zone, but it's not that it's not challenging. It takes some focus, it takes some muscular endurance, it takes some strength to be in zone 3. And as you get to your upper zone 3, you may hear this referred to as zone 3 plus or sweet spot. So that's closer to that 85-90% where you're still in that go all day kind of tempo zone, but you're starting to tickle that zone 4 or that threshold rate a little bit, where you're kind of maximizing on that balance between power and your more efficient aerobic zones. So it's a good zone to work. It's an important zone to work. Your rate of perceived exertion, depending on where in that zone you're going to be, because as you get higher, that difference in percentage. So we're talking about a 15% swing in that zone. That 15% is a lot more critical, like from percent to percent, than maybe that 0 to 55 that you see in zone 1. Being at that 76% is going to feel a hell of a lot different than being at that 89%. It's a completely different ball game. So depending on where you are, your rate of perceived exertion can go anywhere from about a 4 to maybe a 7 out of 10. So next is your important one. This is your zone 4. It can be called as functional threshold or lactate threshold. This is your threshold zone. This is you're about 100%, but it's never measured as exactly 100%. So if your FTP is 300 watts, it's not just 300 watts. This is a range that covers anywhere between 91 to 105% of that functional threshold number. So it is in fact a range. So this, on a rate of perceived exertion, this is probably about an 8. This is uncomfortable, but not possible. And if you've heard the term burning matches, which is kind of surging, if you're holding this more of a steady state, you are able to kind of withstand this kind of pain and intensity for conceivably an hour. That's what your 1 hour power, like I've mentioned before. So this is a difficult zone to be in. This is a zone that you kind of work on as you're doing threshold work, as you're trying to push up your functional threshold power. But it's not an area where in your training, unless you're doing speed work, if you're doing 20-minute intervals, you don't spend the whole of your ride at that zone 4. It's selected for particular intervals or for testing, or obviously if you're in a race, you're going to spend more time in that zone. So zone 5 is going to be the next level up in power, and this is very, for very short bursts of power. This is anywhere between 106% and 120% of your FTP. And this is very short duration work, like I said. These bursts and your capability for Vo2 Max usually ranges between 3 and 8 minutes to be able to sustain that. And it's going to be very uncomfortable. We're talking about a rate of perceived exertion of 9 or more. It's something that you can work on. It's not quite your sprint level power, but it's just, you're kind of going all in at this point. So if you're trying to catch the breakaway in a race, or you're leading out for a sprint, or you're trying to kind of hurry up and get up that hill, get up that little kicker before your legs break apart, so you're putting everything you have into it, that is your Vo2 Max level power. I'm not going to get too specifics into Vo2 Max as the idea of Vo2 Max. Generally speaking, it's your ability to kind of continue to convert oxygen into carbon dioxide, and how much of the oxygen you're expelling. It's got to be measured again in a lab with kind of a breathing machine. So for you to actually know specifically what your physical Vo2 max is, you'd have to have that tested. But in terms of your output, your power, generally speaking, you're going to be somewhere close to that particular Vo2 max in that power range. Zone 6 and 7 get a little bit muddled in terms of percentages. A lot of that is going to depend on your body composition, your size, whether you're a woman or a man. The percentages get really not particularly accurate, but I will give you an idea of what these two zones denote. So Zone 6 is your anaerobic threshold type of power. So that's going to be, again, you're over your Vo2 max. You're going to be able to hold this power for 30 seconds, 3 minutes if you're really lucky and you're turning yourself inside out. You're not going to have much left there. You may be leading out at a, if you're the last lead out guy for a sprinter, you're probably going to be at your Zone 6 or anaerobic power. You technically don't even need to breathe on one of these 30-second anaerobic level efforts. I wouldn't recommend not breathing, but you're not using oxygen anymore to fuel your muscles or maintain energy. It's completely anaerobic. That's what anaerobic means. You're no longer using your aerobic system to fuel your engine. You are just going on brute muscle and strength. Zone 7 is neuromuscular power. Basically, the delineation between Zone 6 and Zone 7 is Zone 6, you've got a little bit of latitude in terms of time. Zone 7 is literally your full-on sprint level power. It's 30 seconds or less of being able to hold something. It's everything you've got. It's throwing every last micron of your musculature into your power. Your whole body's in there. It's your max power. It's not aerobic, it's completely anaerobic, and it's just a mind muscle kind of thing. How much can your brain tell your muscles to suffer to get through a very, very finite period of time? It can go anywhere between a couple seconds, and like I said, 30 seconds. 30 seconds is a stretch. You're probably talking more 10 to 20 seconds max. So knowing these zones, you don't have to have them memorized. If you have them written down somewhere, if you've got them on your top tube while you're doing intervals, in the house, eventually you'll get to the point where you kind of remember them and you know those ranges. But as you're kind of starting out, or if you're new to structured training, or you're new to power, it's good to know those because it's talked about a lot. Power zones are talked about quite a bit when it comes to, articles about cycling, studies, training programs, training plans. Knowing where your zones are and where you should be working is of paramount importance. You've probably heard kind of an adage in cycling and in sport in general that a lot of people are working too hard or not working hard enough when they're on the bike. They're not in that proper zone where they're being effective. So, going out and maybe not quite touching on those intervals that you need to touch on, you're not working hard enough, so you're kind of in that gray zone. You're not quite at Zone 2, but you're not really doing your sweet spot work or your threshold work. you're kind of in that no man's land. So spending all your time in tempo, low tempo zones, low zone 3, you're not going to yield any results. You're just going to really kind of maintain your general fitness. So that's kind of where they're talking about your gray man's land, where you're either working too hard or not hard enough. And then some other people like to go out and all they do is high intensity stuff. Like they'll just go out and do hill repeats all the time, or they'll do nothing but, you know, blast their legs on climbs at zone 4, zone 5, but they're not working their aerobics engine in that zone 2 area. So that's something to be cognizant of, and if you're aware of your zones and you follow a good quality plan, you should be set up pretty well to succeed and just to see progress. That's really the important part, is seeing progress. And even if you don't necessarily see your fitness make huge leaps forward in terms of your technique, your comfort level on the bike, your ability to withstand fatigue and longer distance and duration, even if you don't see it in terms of numbers, it's going to yield benefits for you in the long run, being a better cyclist, whether your intention is to race or ride casually, what have you. Putting a little attention into your training helps. So I hope that, you know, going through some of these terms and acronyms and some of this stuff that you probably see quite a bit of when you might be reading that article in Bicycling Magazine, or you're checking on Strava, or you're looking at TrainingPeaks. You know, what do all these numbers mean? What do all these analytics mean? Hopefully this will clarify some things for you. I tried to explain these things in a way that kind of made sense, but sometimes it's tough when you're not, you know, right next to somebody and you can show them how they relate to their numbers. But feel free to leave any comments, questions, concerns, or any kind of input or clarification that you think might be helpful to people viewing or reading the comments. Feel free to leave them down below. But I'm going to get my butt into work, and I'm going to test a completely different type of threshold, and that's my tolerance for stupidity. But thank you guys so much for watching. I very much appreciate the support of the channel, and I'll catch you in the next one.